Hi, everyone. So today I'm continuing the flight training leadership interview series, interviewing flight training school leaders around the world to get their insights on how COVID has affected them and their current state of operations. Today I have the absolute pleasure to speak with Patrick Richardson, who is the owner and chief pilot of Select Aviation College in Canada. Select Aviation College is one of the leading schools in Canada, which is training both Canadian and international students from all over the world, and has a fleet of around 30 different aircraft. I briefly spoke with Patrick before starting this interview, and he will share some really positive things which are happening in Canada as well. So, hi, Patrick. Thank you for being with us today. And please tell us a bit more about your organization.
Pleasure, Max. Select Aviation College. We've started operations about 6 years ago. Started off as a small school, one student, then grew into about 120 students today. Over the years, we've became approved as an integrated ATPL flight training center. We're also a college. We're our own college. We're not a college through affiliation. We're directly approved by the Ministry of Education. We offer 5 different college programs in aviation. 2 are airline oriented, 2 are helicopter oriented, and we also have a bush pilot college program. So all of these programs are basically 2-year programs. If one wants to complete with an instructor rating, it takes a little bit more time, probably 2.5 years. These programs tailor to local students and international students. I'd say that today our student base is from actually 30 different countries, if not more. So we have probably 15 to 20% of our students would be Canadians, and the rest are from all over the world. So we have a great time at what we do, even though the last couple of months have been wild, to say the least. On the 13th of March, we stopped all operations, so we had to shut down the school. The students all went home. We actually supply our accommodations to probably 80 or 90% of the students that are here with us. So we asked them to stay confined. We put together some online ground school for everyone. Within about 6 or 7 days, everyone was on an online platform. They were actually at least able to keep following their courses remotely and keep advancing, keep progressing with their exams and getting ready for the official Transport Canada and Ministry exams. No, it's been quite a ride. We're really looking forward to resuming our flight operations. We're actually starting again next week.
Okay, and just before COVID started, for large parts of the industries, it was really, record growth, and month on month, enrollment numbers increased. There's a huge demand for airline pilots in quite a few of the different regions around the world, not in all. How was the time for you in Canada just before the current COVID challenge?
Well, you see, we do not have any cadet programs at Select Aviation College. We train students that we meet in international fairs, that contact us via our social media. Other than some government contracts with African military organizations where we do train military pilots, the huge majority of students are basically from, like I was saying before, 30 different countries, and we've met them on an individual basis. So of course the demand was high, but you see, we're a very selective organization. We were taking the time to interview everyone who would apply, and we, it's a question of progressive growth and controlled growth. So we have grown in a matter of 6 years from 2-3 airplanes to the 30 machines that we have today and 120 students that we have today. Yet we could have grown beyond that number. We
Yeah.
could have expected a lot more students. We could have went for the international, the airline cadet programs, but we didn't choose to go that route.
Yeah.
We preferred to just grow progressively and constantly and in a controlled way. So the demand was very high before. However, surprisingly, the demand is still there. I was expecting for new enrollment to just drop, of course. Everyone's confined, no one's moving, but we've seen, I can't say we're seeing the same amount of registrations that we were seeing in the years past for the same months, but the demand is still there, and we're registering several new students every month.
That's really fantastic to hear. Through our platform, we are seeing exactly the same trend. So even though airlines are in large parts of the world, downsizing and letting go of a lot of pilots, and it will be a difficult time for a large part of the industry. A lot of the aspiring pilots around the world, their mindset really is one in which they know that if they start up their pilot training now, they will, complete the training in 1.5, 2.5 years. And by that time, things would have gone back to not maybe the same normal as it was before, but certainly something which should hopefully look very similar, and the industry would have recovered. So that's where we're seeing the same trend in that regard. So it's really good to hear that you're getting the same number of or a similar amount of interest. What about your actual operations though? So, you just mentioned the date in March. So kind of what kind of phase has your flight school gone through? What is the current status of operations now? What are the different things you have implemented in terms of your risk mitigation strategies? Can you just share a bit more information on that?
Of course. I mean, the first thing was to keep everyone safe. That was the number one priority. Now, just remember that we are housing and we're providing accommodations as far as transportation to the bulk of our students. We didn't want anybody to get sick. So the first thing was to communicate the regulations from Health Canada to our students and put together a team. We actually had one of our students who's a doctor. We put together a hotline for any students who would be worried or think they might have some symptoms, asked for them to call this student called Ignacio. We just wanted to make sure that everyone was at home, feeling safe, feeling comfortable. So we were there for them. That was the first thing. After a couple of days, I think things started to set in. Our students were seeing what was happening everywhere in the world, and they understood that, listen, they were just going to have to stay home, have to stay confined, and have to be patient. So from there, we put together the online ground school for them that they followed, and we just kept bridging the information from our government to our students, and communicating with parents, communicating with our students, just keeping the morale up, and making sure that everyone was complying with the regulations. We sure didn't want anyone to get sick. We wanted people to comply. It's not easy. Our students are young. They're 18, 19, 20 years old, just like it is for everyone else in the world. It was extremely hard for them to stay at home, stay confined, but we had to stick with them and make sure that they were complying with the regulations, and just listen to them and be there for them. That was the number one priority throughout all of this, was just to make sure they were okay. So we spent the last 2 months just being with our students on a regular basis via the online, via review sessions, being there for them, handling the mail, anything that we could do to keep them comfortable and safe, we did. Some of them, for instance, I think we were delivering groceries to them if they didn't want to leave their apartments. Just being in between students that were afraid to be contaminated. For instance, if one of their roommates would work, some students were nervous that they could bring the virus back. I mean, there's just so many cases that we dealt with. We put together a whole quarantine facility from the get-go in case students would get in. We didn't want any contamination to be, or at least reduce the risk of possible contamination. So we actually had over 30 quarantine rooms ready in case something would happen. And luckily we didn't use any of them. They were all stocked up with food and everything else, and we didn't have to use any of them. You see right now with the startup of the operations, we're starting up on the 25th May. You see some of the students will be returning to Drummondville. Some left, some went to their families in Montreal, or went into another province where they might have friends that they've decided to quarantine with. Well, there's a new quarantine when these students come back. So we have just getting ready with the facilities, and all the other sanitation measures have taken so much time, and it's a question of doing things right. So we've put a lot of energy there, but I think it was all worth it.
So do I understand that correctly? For your returning students, they will or they should ideally quarantine in your quarantine facilities for 2 weeks if they're returning to your on your school provided accommodation?
That's right. We're not going to let any students go back into our accommodations if they're traveling from out of country without quarantining. So they're not going to be allowed to return to flying. They're not going to be allowed to come to the college, and they're actually not even going to be allowed to go back to their own apartment. You see, they might have there's usually 3 students per apartment. Now, if 2 students remained here in Drummondville through the quarantine and another decided to go back home, for instance, we have students that went back to France, well, they will not be allowed to go straight to their apartment. There's an apartment that's ready as a quarantine for 2 weeks for any students that are traveling back to Drummondville from international.
Okay, and it's really good to hear that you're aiming to restart operations next week, specifically flight training operations. Could you just maybe share? I think a lot of the wider industry in a lot of countries, flight training is still not permitted. Just some of the policies that you've evaluated, some of the things that you've implemented, what has been all put in place in kind of your risk mitigation measures to get to the point where now you feel in a good position to safely restart flight training operations?
Yes, of course. We've put together a guide with other members in our industry. A tremendous amount of measures, safety measures have been put together in this guide, which we submitted to the health authorities. It was approved, I believe, 10 days ago. So middle of last week, we could have resumed flight operations, but just putting together the measures and make sure that they're implemented, run them through some testing is going to take us at least another 7 or 8 days. So that's why we're opening only next week. Some of the measures are pretty basic. Of course, the dispatch areas, the college is closed, so no one's allowed into the college. Only flight and simulator training is going to resume. For instance, before students were expected to show up about an hour before a flight. They would prepare their navigation, they would prepare their flights, their weight and balance and whatnot. Some was still done on paper charts, etc. They're not going to be allowed to do that anymore. You see the navigations, all the flights, weight and balance, etc., are going to have to be prepared from home. Students put their mask on before they leave home, put their gloves on, they travel to school. Only once their instructor has approved their flight via email or via our air supervision system. It's an online platform that we have to control all requirements and
Yeah.
make sure that everyone's up to date on everything. So we've had to put together and a lot of modifications to the system for everything to be done remotely. Just for instance, we usually have students sign an iPad just to make sure that they acknowledge
Yeah.
the weight balance, and we can't do that anymore. So everything now has to be done via their own smartphone. So we've had to put together a smartphone app that's compatible with the signing system and everything else. So it's been a learning curve, getting together the sanitation procedures, getting together the ground crew to clean the aircraft between each flight, making sure that students understand their responsibilities. We do expect students to wipe down the control surfaces of the aircraft, wipe down the control columns, the power levers, etc., have to be cleaned by the student and the instructor. After each flight will do his part, students do their part, make sure that they acknowledge and understand all these changes.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a tremendous amount of new procedures. For these are flight training students, they already have a tremendous amount of work. Getting used to their regular checklist. We've just put on a tremendous amount of workload that they're going to have to deal with. And these measures are probably going to stay in the industry. They're most likely going to be working in an environment that's going to include and have to integrate a tremendous amount of sanitation procedures. So we feel that as a college, it's just the time to do things right and work on these procedures and make sure that they understand them and that they apply them correctly. In the industry from now on, there's going to be zero tolerance. It's going to be complete unprofessionalism if pilots and air crew aren't able to apply these sanitary procedures that are being put in place by all the air operators around there. So it's time for students, and it's time for us to apply them and make sure that everyone follows them.
Yeah. I think that's really an excellent point, specifically in regards to implementing and training all these new procedures. So this is something which I've gathered over the past few weeks, that flight schools around the world, of course, want to all aim to restart flight training operations as quickly as possible and as quickly as it's deemed safe. But that also, especially flight schools which are not yet operating yet, also consider the time that it's going to take to train all the staff and all the students on each of these new procedures, which is most probably in most cases going to be maybe longer than what people were initially planning for. And so even though a flight training school will be allowed to, let's say, start on a Monday, that especially the ramping up should be done at a very cautious level to really check that all these new procedures, which can overwhelm both the student and the instructors or even staff, are followed to a T.
It's definitely a lot of work, and it's not just one thing to write the procedures down. You got to make sure that everyone understands the procedures. We're creating exams for, say, we're creating new competencies in our systems. So no one's going to be allowed to fly, first of all, if they didn't pass the exam with 100%. It's an open book exam on all the new procedures. And we know those procedures are going to be changing. We're going to start flying. We're going to be using those procedures, and we have a lot of smart people. Our students, our instructors are going to have some constructive criticism. We're going to have to upgrade. We're going to have to make some changes. We're going to have to communicate those changes, make sure that everyone understands those changes. There's a tremendous amount of work, and no one, I don't think anyone can just flip on a switch and say tomorrow morning we're going to be operating full blown like we were 3 months ago or like we were last summer, and everyone's understanding these procedures perfectly. It's going to take time. We're going to have to do it slow. We're going to have to take our time, and most important thing is to make sure that we're applying and doing this right. So this week is a test week. We are starting flights again. Actually, our Class 1 instructors are going to resume flights with our instructor students. And we're going to be testing the procedures. We're going to be making them better, and we're going to be changing them if we need to. And we're going to start off slow, only about a week from now.
Okay, fantastic. Really, that's really thank you for sharing these insights. Talking about not only your operations, but very specifically, I wanna ask you about, Canada is very much known as a country which, embraces immigration and certainly has immigration procedures which are quite a bit different compared to its neighbor down south. Could you just maybe explain more about, seeing that so much or so many of your students are from, all over the world? What you've seen in terms of the immigration procedures, has there been any changes? When do you think the granting of visas will restart? Do you see any issue in, enrolling and taking in international students? So it would be great to hear your insights on that, because I know you're going to share with us some fairly positive news.
Of course, of course. Since the beginning, we've always been quite involved in the visa or student permit process. So we do know a thing or two about them. Sure, I'll share what I know so far. First of all, Canada, I can't thank them enough. They've really done a good job. They've put together what they call the CERB, Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, which is a program that all Canadians, including students under certain circumstances, could apply for. Any student who was already working in Canada, just as an example, when you're in Canada with a study permit, you are allowed to work 20 hours a week. So if you were working 20 hours a week for, say, a student, an international student who would arrived here last September and started working, has a part-time job, if that student would have earned at least $5,000 in the last 12 months and lost his job because of COVID, or her job because of COVID, the student could apply for the emergency relief benefit. So that was $2,000 a month that's taxable, but that was given directly to the students right away. So at least they were able to get some help. Anyone who was used to getting some revenue and lost it because of COVID, they were able to get some help. I'm very thankful to the government for that. In terms of granting visas and study permits, it's slowed down, but study permits are still being approved. In Quebec, it's a two-phase process. So first, you would apply for your certificate of acceptance to Quebec, called the CAQ. Normally, those take about 3-4 weeks for an international student to obtain. It's taken longer. But just for instance, yesterday, we've seen the approval of 15 different CAQs. Once the CAQ is approved, we file it to Immigration Canada for our students to receive their study permit, and we are seeing study permits being approved. Students who have left Canada during the COVID phase are still welcome to come back to Canada, or anyone who's been granted a visa before March 13th is free to come into Canada, even if they were not in Canada before. So we're still open to our international students. Anyone arriving needs to be quarantined, needs to spend 2 weeks in not a designated quarantine facility, but they have to keep themselves isolated. And it's going to be important for them to have prearranged quarantine plans, because it's very, very possible that customs agents will be asking if they have a quarantine plan that's set up already.
Yeah.
But other than that, we are seeing visas approved. I think it's slowing down, but we're mostly subject to the travel restrictions more than the visas right now.
I think this is really something which, when you told me this, very much pleasantly surprised me, and I think this is certainly going to provide some sense of a positive mindset to flight school in other countries who are also training a lot of international students, and they will certainly be looking to see what Canada is doing, what systems and processes they're implementing to continue or to continue the system. So where do you see things, like looking into the crystal ball now, where do you see things going, both for Select Aviation College and for the wider pilot training industry in the near-term future?
I think there's gonna be a slowdown observed across the industry. If I look into my crystal ball, I think it's going to be a year at the most. But I think that we're gonna. Actually, I don't want to sound overly optimistic, but I think we're going to go into. We're going to go back into panic mode with a tremendous amount of demand for flight training, probably in about a year from now. Of course, right now, cash is king everywhere, and everyone is tight on cash flow, especially if you're looking at the airline industry, where there's been a complete stop. I mean, if you're operating a fleet of 100 airliners, you have zero money coming in, you have millions and millions and millions going out, and everyone is going to panic. If you're operating and you're managing investor money, or you're a 100% private company and you're trying to run this today, you have to cut your expenses. And where do you cut your expenses? Any aircraft that are getting older, you're going to try and thin down your fleet. If some of your routes weren't profitable before, you're going to cut those down. You're going to look at your highest salaries and you're going to say, oh, I'm going to have to try and do something and see if some of these guys can go into early retirement, or I got to do something to stop the bleeding. And the industry is bleeding cash right now. It's hard for everyone, but things are going to get going again. Routes are going to open up. There's positive news. We see talks about vaccine. We see new ways to keep surfaces sanitized, to keep airplanes sanitized, purification systems, and we just need the fear to gradually start to go away, and it will. It will. We are going to get through this. It's not just the airline industry. We're talking 90% of the industries that are out there that are being drastically affected by this. There are measures that are being put in place by all of our governments to get the economy started again, and it will start. I bought a lot of airline stock personally. I can tell you that.
I really love the optimism. I really love the optimism, and I have to especially highlight the point which you mentioned earlier, which is something, especially I think in North America and in Europe, which we'll see, is that specifically North America, it is quite known that over the past few years, the retirement wave, so-called retirement wave of airline pilots, was being featured more and more in the media. And so there's also a lot of discussions right now that the current challenges are going to lead to a possible acceleration of this retirement wave, with airlines looking to speak with the very experienced airline captains who are getting close to retirement age, and discussing with them possible early retirement, which of course is going to then, for each and every senior captain leaving the airline, it's going to, create so many new roles for first officers and everyone moving back up through the system. And so I agree also based on the data that we've seen so far that what might happen, and this is a very optimistic scenario, is that this current challenge might be like this bump in the road, but it might actually make the demand and requirement for airline pilots around 2 years down the road maybe greater than before, with this retirement wave having accelerated and maybe aspiring pilots having put off pilot training. So there's also that scenario which could possibly develop. One of the things which I wanted to highlight about you, which I find really great, and I just want to reiterate the point again. So based on the courses that you're offering in the US to aspiring pilots, they can work at the same time while they are studying. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. They can work on campus full time. They
Okay.
can work off campus a maximum of 20 hours a week. They can work off campus full time during breaks. So if there's a summer break or winter holiday, they can work full time. They also qualify for a postgraduate work permit. So if they follow a college program, that's pretty much all we're offering right now. It's a 2-year college program. It qualifies them for a 3-year postgraduate work permit. And that's an open work permit. So if someone follows a flight training program or any college or university program in Canada, they do qualify to apply for a postgraduate work permit. And from there, there is some immigration possibilities. Even if someone wants to stay longer, once they've completed a program, they can think of staying short, medium, and long term in Canada following their flight training or university program.
Okay, I think this is really a fantastic point. So for all aspiring pilots out there, even if your concern is that it will take a while for the wider airline industry to come back, one of the options which you have through Select Aviation and doing your pilot training in Canada is to get this 3-year work permit upon completing the training with them. Patrick, let me ask you, are there any stakeholders which you would like to connect with in the industry, maybe to align with your growth strategy, or maybe just to align with your current operations or all the activities you're currently engaged in?
I think as an industry, the most important thing, and that's what I've always seen through many years, is it's a huge fraternity. I'm not shy to call any other flight school owner. I don't think that any should be shy to call me VP of operations of airlines in terms of partnerships for flight training and with cadets. We're just a phone call away is what it's always been. If I need to call someone, I will call them, and I've always had very, very, very good response. And just don't be shy. I mean, we're there to help each other out. This industry it's a strong industry. We're united. It's now is more than ever a time to just be there, just to listen to each other. If we have challenges to share, Max, you're doing a great job. What you're doing now with these interviews and just bringing the industry together is just a fantastic way for all of us to pitch in, help each other with our own challenges, with experiences that we've been through over the last couple of months. Just don't be shy to ask is what I say, and I think most other members in this industry share that philosophy.
Okay, so as you know, I'm definitely putting your LinkedIn profile link in the caption and in the description of this interview. So please, everyone, go ahead and check out Patrick's profile and connect with him. Patrick, thank you very much for sharing your insights. It really sounds like you're in a good position and you're ready for the future growth, which will return. Um, and yeah, I really wish you all the best. I hope all your students get back into the air as quickly and as safely as possible. And thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Max. All the best to you, and keep in touch.
Will do, will do.